Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Hot Pot. I'm so excited to have Stephanie here on the show with us. Stephanie, can you share us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, my name is Stephanie Drenka. I am a Korean adoptee living in Dallas, Texas. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Dallas Asian American Historical Society, and I'm also a writer and facilitator and coach with the OpEd Project.
Awesome. You're doing a ton of amazing work and kind of would love to talk a little bit about each of the things that you mentioned. I think something that you mentioned is being a Korean adoptee. Would love to kind of hear your experience. What was that like growing up? How did that kind of become a platform that you speak about now?
So I was adopted at the age of 3 months old from South Korea by a white family. So I'm a transracial adoptee. And I've grown up in predominantly white communities. So my parents were born and raised in Chicago, but we moved to Marietta, Georgia when I was 2 years old, and then to a suburb called South Lake, Texas when I was 10. And that's where I graduated from in high school. And then I went to Chicago for college. So my experience as an adoptee was predominantly not fitting in, not only with my family, but with the community, with my fellow students and my friends, and just not having a sense of my own place in the world or the community around me. And especially in Texas, where Asian American history is not taught, I didn't see myself in textbooks. I didn't see myself in the media, in books that I was reading, in movies that I watched. So it was a very isolating experience.
Yeah, that's definitely tough not kind of having a place necessarily, I guess, to call home in the Asian American community. But I know that you founded the Dallas Asian American Historical Society, which talks about the Asian American legacy in Dallas. How did your experience lead you to that organization?
So being adopted and not having access to my own family history and origins, I think history was something I realized that I valued because I didn't have it
Mm.
personally. And so when I decided to go to college, I was looking for somewhere that had a more diverse student body that would give me access to classes and professors that resonated with me or that represented me. And so I chose DePaul University in Chicago, Illinois. And when I was a freshman there, it was the first year that they were offering Asian American Studies as a minor. And so I got involved with the Asian student organizations on campus. I eventually became president of the Asian Cultural Exchange, and I started taking Asian American Studies classes. I started just by signing up for Asian American Studies 101, and I thought, I'm just going to support the program. But I was a communications major, and I had planned a minor in political science. But I took one class and got hooked. It was the class where we learned everything: Vincent Chin, the LA riots. I had never learned about so many Asian American heroes, journalists like Helen Zia, and I switched my minor to Asian American Studies and women's and gender studies. I double minored because I was very interested in the intersection of race and gender and how Asian American women are represented in the media. So during that time in college, I got involved with a advocacy group called the 121 Coalition, and they were advocating for the passage of House Resolution 121, which at the time was calling on the Japanese government to formally apologize to the survivors of sexual enslavement during World War II. And so through that experience, I was invited to go to Korea for the first time. And while I was there, I visited my adoption agency, who informed me that I had two biological sisters that I did not know about. And so it started this really long journey to find my own, to find my family, to find my own family history. I was reunited with them in 2012. And sorry, my class. I was reunited with them in 2012 and came back, and my work was around just general nonprofit work. I was working for a youth development organization, but I just felt like I had this story inside of me now that I had found my birth family and learned all the things that I thought about my origin story were completely false. and I decided to apply for a Public Voices Fellowship with the OpEd Project, who I now work with.
Mhm.
And their mission is to amplify the thought leadership of underrepresented voices, women of color, through op-ed writing. And so I used my expertise as a Korean adoptee to talk about issues with the adoption system with Asian American representation in general, and had the opportunity to be published in outlets like HuffPost and Newsweek, Ms. Magazine, etc.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your journey. I think I have two follow-up questions from what you've shared, but you mentioned going to DePaul University and actually taking Asian American courses and being part of the clubs there. How was that experience going from a predominantly white kind of environment to finally being surrounded by people who look like you and kind of share those similar experiences?
It's very embarrassing to share this, but the first time I went to a Korean student organization meeting my freshman year, I went to one meeting and I was so overwhelmed because I had never been in a room not only with people who looked like me, but a lot of people who were speaking Korean. And I felt for the first time that not only did I not fit in with my white community, but there were some things that set me apart from the Korean community as well. So I didn't go back to another meeting that first quarter. And I think what happened was I came back home for the holidays, and I was home for, I think from Thanksgiving to New Year. We had a long break, and trying to reintegrate with my high school friends in Texas felt different. It felt like, now that I had sort of had a taste of what more diversity and inclusion looked like, I didn't fit in back here again. So when I went back for the next quarter, I really recommitted to that journey and got, made friends and felt, like I belonged again. But it was a slower process to deal with some of that internalized racism that I had grown up with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have the opposite experience. I grew up in Hawaii, so grew up in a very diverse environment, but I went to school in South Bend, Indiana, which is predominantly white. And so I think that's why I find your story so interesting, is that you went to college and kind of learned a little bit more about, your history and your culture. And I kind of had that same experience when I went to South Bend, Indiana, because when you're surrounded by people who look like you, people who have the same immigration story as your family, you don't tend to necessarily want to learn. But when I went to college, people were like, oh, tell me more about like your family history, or what does it mean to be Filipino? And I was like, oh, I've never been asked that before. I should probably learn too. And so that's such like a great opportunity to kind of just go to college, learn a little bit more about your history. And then I love how that's now implemented into everything that you're doing now.
Yeah, I guess I didn't even get to starting the historical society. So after I started writing about adoption, I switched to a different nonprofit and was a communications director. And the nonprofit that I worked for was focused on racial equity and racial healing, but all centered around narrative change. So the idea that we can't heal from racism or transform our community unless we tell the full story of race and racism in our community locally and nationally. And so I was doing a lot of historic research and sharing stories about Dallas and the racism that different communities faced here, but I somehow neglected telling the stories of Asian Americans in my own community. I think it was a fear. I was the only Asian American on staff, and I think I was afraid of making it seem like I was overrepresenting myself or my community, and so I shied away from it. And it was really the rising reports of anti-Asian hate crimes after COVID, and then specifically the Atlanta area shootings that kind of thrust me into the local spotlight. I was getting asked to sit on a lot of panels and talk about the history of Asian Americans in this community and in Dallas. And I was looking around at my other panelists, and they were, representing the business community or maybe like a political science professor, but I just kept thinking to myself, where are the Asian American history experts? Why am I the one on this panel? And so I started doing some research and looking for organizations doing historical preservation in the Asian American community, and there were none locally. And even, nationally, there's a lot of historical societies that are focused on certain nationalities or ethnicities, but nothing that is encompassing Asian Americans. And so my co-founder and I, we've been friends for 10 years, decided that if nobody else was doing it here, we might as well see what we can do and build something sustainable. And we decided to form a nonprofit.
Yeah, I love that. Something that I spoke with another guest on the show about was how to use your voice as an Asian American woman. And I think that's exactly what you did, is you had a seat at the table, you looked around and noticed something was missing, and then you and your friend founded the group to really showcase Asian American history in Dallas. And I think that's so important, because I learned recently there's a huge Asian American population in Dallas. And I remember asking someone, why is that? Like, why is there a huge Asian American in Dallas?
Yeah, I think there's different stories based on different timelines and ethnicities, but I would say we are the fastest growing population in North Texas, Asian Americans. A lot of Southeast Asians were resettled here during the 80s, and it was also a popular destination in terms of higher ed for the South Asian population. So we had a lot of grad students, engineers, et cetera. And then the earliest immigrants in Texas and in Dallas in particular were Chinese immigrants. So after finishing the work on the Central Pacific Railroad, they were hired to work on the Houston and Texas Central Railroad. And so they came from San Francisco to Galveston, working on the railroad up to Dallas. And Dallas was sort of the end of the line there. And so I think a lot of the early immigrants stayed here and settled.
That's awesome. Does your organization have a website where we can learn a little bit more, or how do we kind of get in touch?
We do. Our website is dallasasianhistory.org, and our social media channels are linked from there. And on our website, we've started to collect artifacts from community members. And so we've been digitizing photos and documentation. We have oral history workshops where people can come and share their story on video with us. So we're transcribing the videos right now so we can share them on YouTube. But on our website, if you click on Explore Our Collections, you can see some of the artifacts we've started collecting from Chinese restaurants, from family members, and just getting a glimpse of what everyday life was like for Asian Americans in Dallas has been really fascinating to me.
Yeah, it sounds really cool. I'll be sure to link that in the description below. I know you also mentioned you're a writer and a photographer, kind of hold different hats or wear different hats. Can you talk a little bit more about those?
Yeah, my mom is a librarian, and so I grew up surrounded by books and stories. And I think, for young children who feel like they don't belong, imagination can be a really powerful haven and place to escape. So I grew up reading books, and I think writing was kind of just an extension of that. And photography was sort of an accidental. I was interested in journalism, so had to learn how to take photos in newspaper class and loved it. And so I was actually doing it professionally for a while, working in the fashion blogging industry. And I've had a lot of different jobs and interests over the years, but everything really boils down to storytelling and seeing ourselves reflected in ways that make us feel proud or make us feel authentic and seen. And so I get to apply a lot of that in my work with the Historical Society, because photographs are historical artifacts. And so we're documenting history as it's happening now, along with preserving photographs and video, et cetera, from past days.
Yeah, I love that. I know you do a multitude of different things, and storytelling is such a big piece in Asian American history and our history. But what motivates you to kind of do all of the work that you're doing? What keeps you going?
At the OpEd Project, part of the curriculum, they ask us to narrow down our vision into why we do what we do and be able to say it, articulate it in less than a sentence. And so my why I do what I do boiled down to because it matters to someone. And that was based on thinking about who I needed when I was growing up, what it would have done, the difference it would have made if I had known there were other people who experienced similar things. There were other adoptees who felt the same way that I did, and that I wasn't alone. And so when I think about my storytelling and my writing, it's not necessarily to reach the largest amount of people possible. It's just in the hope that the person who most needs to read it at that moment has access to it, and that it somehow validates them and makes them feel seen or heard.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. What is your legacy? I know you spoke a little bit about it in your previous answer, but what is your legacy?
Yeah, I think my legacy at this point, because I've done a lot of varying things, but I think ultimately the larger theme is that I've helped create platforms for stories to be uplifted in ways that have not been possible previously. So I guess I forgot to mention, I also created an online magazine called Visible, and it was kind of stemming from my OpEd project work, where I was realizing it was very difficult for people without traditional credentials or sort of what dominant culture deems as expert to be published. And so I created a magazine where people could share their stories in their own words without traditional gatekeepers. And I think that's a little bit what I do with the Dallas Asian American Historical Society. Is I hope that my legacy is that I've made people feel like their stories are important and significant and belong in this larger narrative of America, of the world, and that it has created opportunities for people to have their stories told on the record and to have something outlive, all of us.
Yeah, no, I think you've done just that. I mean, I haven't really heard of another organization or another person really gathering these stories and showcasing it in a way that when we look back on it years from now, like our children, our great grandchildren, the generations after us will be able to look at it and be like, yeah, that's my family history, or this is why being Asian American is so important to me. Because I think for our generation, especially, is we had to learn that somehow, either because you were an adoptee, or for me personally, because my parents necessarily assimilated to the culture that they moved into versus wanting to share a little bit more about where they came from. And so I really love the opportunity for Asian Americans to kind of visually and just listen to different stories of our history, because it's so important. And I for sure I'm gonna link that in the description, because it's Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and stories are always showcased throughout this month, but we should always be celebrating what it means to be Asian American. And I'm so excited to kind of look at the site and listen to so many of those stories, because I think I have so much to learn still, and so I'm excited to kind of check those out.
Thank you so much. The one thing that I like to sort of impart, or as a call to action during Heritage Month, is for people to think about the definition of heritage. And, I always wondered, why is it Asian American Heritage Month and not History Month, like Black History Month or Women's History Month? And for a while I was sort of resentful that that they gave us Heritage Month instead of history. But then I realized it is because the onus is on us to pass down our history and our legacy to future generations, because we aren't taught it by dominant culture. And so when I think of heritage and talk about the work that we do during this month, it's always, this is our responsibility to pass it down, to gift it, to leave it behind for future generations. And so heritage has to be a call to action for us. It's not something we necessarily just celebrate. It's something that we have to do, and it's something that we have to leave behind.
Yes, I love that. Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining me on the show, taking time. I know it's a very busy month for you, so really appreciate you.
Thank you. I appreciate sharing space with you and having, the opportunity to celebrate us and our stories.